David John Burney and Catherine Margaret Burney were an Australian couple from Perth, Western Australia, who murdered 4 women at their home in 1986 and attempted to murder a 5th. These crimes were referred to in the press as the Moorhouse murders, after the Burneys' address at 3 Moorhouse Street in Willagee, a suburb of Perth. David Burney was the oldest of 5 children and grew up in Wattle Grove, Western Australia, a semi-rural suburb of Perth. School friends and acquaintances from church remember the family as having been dysfunctional and subject to frequent rumors involving alcoholism, promiscuity, and incest. The family never had regular meals together, and Burney's parents did not cook meals for their children. In the early 1960s, Burney's parents decided to move the family to another Perth suburb, where Burney met Catherine Harrison through mutual friends. At age 15, Burney left school to become an apprentice jockey for Eric Parnham at the nearby Ascot racecourse. During his time there, Burney physically abused the horses and developed a habit of exhibitionism. One night, Burney, wearing only stockings over his head, broke into the room of an elderly lady where he was boarding and attempted to rape her. By the time he was an adolescent, Burney had been in and out of prison for several misdemeanors and felonies. As an adult, he became addicted to sex and pornography, and was a paraphiliac. He married his first wife during his early 20s, and the couple had a daughter, Tanya, who was age 10 at the time of his arrest. Tanya, who has changed her surname since Burney's capture, has never married and had no children, stating, "I don't want to spawn another David Burney." Catherine Burney was born Catherine Margaret Harrison on May 23, 1951. She was 2 years old when her mother, Doreen, died giving birth to her brother, who himself died 2 days later. Unable to raise Catherine, her father Harold sent the girl to live with her maternal grandparents. When she was age 10, a custody dispute resulted in Harold regaining sole custody of Catherine. Catherine met David Burney at age 12 and began a relationship with him 2 years later. Her father pleaded with her on several occasions to leave David due to the fact that her involvement with him led to her getting into trouble with the local police. But his disapproval of their relationship only strengthened their union. Her time in prison throughout her adolescent years offered Catherine a chance to break away from David. Encouraged by a parole officer, Catherine began working for the McLaughlin family as a housekeeper. She married Donald McLaughlin on her 21st birthday. She and McLaughlin had 7 children. Their firstborn, a son, was struck and killed by a car in infancy. In 1985, she left her husband and 6 children and went to live with David. The couple was never legally married, but Catherine changed her surname by deed poll to Burney. Crimes. Over a period of 5 weeks, the Burneys abducted 5 women, aged between 15 and 31. All of the victims, except for one, were raped and murdered. The sole exception was their final victim, who escaped the day after her abduction and led police to the Burney house, thus ending their crime spree. Mary Nielsen. Their first victim was Mary. 22-year-old Mary Nielsen was studying psychology at the University of Western Australia and working part-time in a delicatessen when she met David Burney at the spare parts yard where he worked. David offered to sell her cheap tires for her car, and subsequently gave her his phone number. On October 6, 1986, she went to the Burneys' house. She was gagged, chained to the bed and raped by David while Catherine observed. She was taken to Gleneagle, near Albany Highway in Bedfordale, where she was raped again and strangled with a nylon cord. He then stabbed her thinking that it would speed up the decomposition, as he read that in a book somewhere, and they buried her in a shallow grave. She would have received her degree for psychology from the university 1 year after her murder. Susanna Candy. 2 weeks after the murder of Mary Nielsen, they abducted 16-year-old Susanna Candy as she hitchhiked along Stirling Highway in Claremont, Australia. She was an outstanding student at Hollywood Senior High School and lived at home with her parents and siblings in Nedlands, Australia. Her father is one of the top ophthalmic surgeons in Western Australia. After she went missing, the Burneys forced her to send letters to her family to assure them that she was all right. But the family feared for her life. The Burneys had been cruising for hours looking for a victim when they spotted Candy. Once she entered the car, she was held at knife point, while her hands were tied together. She was taken back to the Willagee house where she was gagged, chained to the bed and raped. After Burney had finished raping the girl, Catherine Burney got into the bed with him. She now knew that this turned David on. When they had both assaulted her, Bernie tried to strangle the girl with the nylon cord, but she became hysterical. The Bernies forced sleeping pills down her throat to calm her down. Once Candy was asleep, David put the cord around her neck and told Catherine to prove her undying love for him by murdering the girl. Catherine complied with the demand and killed Candy while David watched. When asked later why she did it, Catherine said, "Because I wanted to see how strong I was within my inner self. I didn't feel a thing. It was like I expected. I was prepared to follow him to the end of the earth, and do anything to see that his desires were satisfied." She was a female. Females hurt and destroy males. They buried Candy near the grave of Mary Nielsen in the state forest. Nolene Patterson. On November 1st, they saw 31-year-old Nolene Patterson standing beside her car on the Canning Highway. She had run out of fuel while on her way home from her job as bar manager at the Ned Land's Golf Club. Once inside the car, she had a knife held to her throat, was tied up, and told not to move. She was taken back to Moorhouse Street, where David repeatedly raped her after she was gagged and chained to the bed. The Bernies originally decided to murder her that same night, but David kept her prisoner in the house for 3 days, and there were signs that he had developed an emotional attachment to Patterson. Catherine quickly became jealous and made an ultimatum. David would have to kill Patterson or Catherine would kill herself. He immediately forced an overdose of sleeping pills down Patterson's throat and strangled her while she slept. They took her body to the forest but buried it away from the others. Catherine reportedly got great pleasure from throwing sand on Patterson's face. Denise Brown. On November 5th, the Bernies abducted 21-year-old Denise Brown as she was waiting for a bus on Sterling Highway. She accepted a ride from them, and at knife point, was taken to the house in Willagee, chained to the bed and raped. The following afternoon she was taken to the Wanneroo Pine Plantation. In the seclusion of the forest, David Bernie raped Brown in the car while the couple waited for darkness. After they dragged Brown from the car, David Bernie raped her again and stabbed Brown in the neck. Convinced that the girl was dead, they dug a shallow grave and laid her body in it, but Brown sat up in the grave. David Bernie then grabbed an axe, struck her twice in the head, and buried her body in the grave. Kate Moyer. 17-year-old Kate Moyer was abducted at knife point after accepting a ride from the Bernies. Moyer later stated that she asked them if they intended to kill or rape her, and was informed, "We will only rape you if you're good." She was forced to dance for them, and slept in the couple's bed while handcuffed to David. Moyer was their final abductee and the only victim to survive. After abducting her, David held a knife to her throat and forced her to ring her mother. Moyer assured her mother that she had too much to drink and was staying at a friend's house, hoping her mother would realize it was a ruse, and called a friend, knowing she was not a drinker. She escaped the day after her capture. After David went to work, Catherine went to the door to carry out a drug deal, and forgot to chain Moyer to the bed. She escaped by climbing through a closed window by breaking its lock. However, she hit her head on the concrete. After knocking on various neighbors' doors, she jumped a gate and was attacked by David's dog. She managed to flee, and ran into a vacuum cleaner shop on November 10, 1986. She later described herself as hysterical. "I'm barefoot wearing my black leggings, a black singlet, no knickers." She informed the shop owner that she had been raped. 11. When the police arrived, she said she had been abducted at knife point by a couple who had taken her back to their house and raped her. The police were initially skeptical of her story, but 22-year-old Constable Laura Hancock believed her from the outset, due to the amount of detail she provided, including their address and telephone number. The Bernies had given themselves aliases, but Moyer had read David's name on a medicine bottle. Moyer stated they had watched the film Rocky on VHS, and described a drawing she had concealed in the house as proof of her presence. Subsequently, the police found her drawing in the home, as well as the VHS copy of Rocky in the Bernies VCR. David and Catherine were arrested, and during their interviews, they gave conflicting information. Catherine denied ever meeting Moyer, while David insisted Moyer had come to their house voluntarily to engage in consensual sex. Detective Sergeant Vince Kadich convinced David to confess, and reveal where they had buried the bodies so that they could be dug up before dark. David revealed there were 4 graves. Trial and sentencing. When sent to trial, David Bernie pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count each of abduction and rape. When asked why he had pleaded guilty, He gestured toward the victims' families and said, "It's the least I could do." He was sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment. After being found sane enough to stand trial, Catherine Burney was also sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment by the Supreme Court of Western Australia. Under law at the time, both were required to serve 20 years before being eligible for parole. Initially, David was held at the maximum security Fremantle prison, but he was soon moved to solitary confinement to keep him from coming to harm from other prisoners. While incarcerated, the Burneys exchanged more than 2,600 letters but were not allowed any other form of contact. David Burney was found dead in his cell at Casuarina Prison on October 7, 2005 at 4:30 a.m. He was 54 years old. An inquest found that he had hanged himself from an air vent using a length of cord. Various factors led to his suicide. A failure to provide him with his antidepressants had exacerbated his depression, his computer had been confiscated, and he was suspected of sexually assaulting another prisoner. He was described by a former prison officer as a model prisoner who looked after injured animals. Catherine was not allowed to attend his funeral. Catherine Burney is imprisoned in Bandyup Women's Prison. Since being incarcerated, she has worked as a prison librarian and appeared in a prison production of No Sense. In 2007, her parole application was rejected, and the then Attorney General of Western Australia, Jim McGuinty, said that her release was unlikely while he remained in office. Her case was to be reviewed again in January 2010. However, on March 14, 2009, new Western Australian Attorney General Christian Porter, following requests from the victims' families, determined she would stay in jail for life. This decision makes her the 3rd Australian woman, after Catherine Knight and Patricia Byers, to have her papers marked never to be released. Her appeal of this decision was turned down in March 2010 by Porter. Her 4th bid for parole was declined in 2016. In 2016, Kate Moyer, the Burneys' final victim, began a campaign to end Western Australian laws that automatically put convicts up for parole every 3 years. Moyer has stated Burney has never even applied for parole. In 2017, Catherine Burney's youngest son, under the alias Peter, called for her execution. He has stated that his relation to Burney has resulted in him being assaulted on multiple occasions. He supports Moyer's campaign.